help me understand. Let's talk a little bit about the Arab Spring. For people who don't know what sparked it, what was the trigger?
I think it's a trap to look for a specific event and say this caused it. What we basically had was like a pressure vessel, which was shut for decades, and the pressure built up. And eventually, one straw broke the camel's back. And that could have been any particular straw. It just happened to be when this fruit seller called Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia had his fruit cart confiscated, and he was so crushed and humiliated that he went and stood in front of a public administration building and poured gasoline on himself and set himself on fire. And nobody expected what came next, but it just spread like wildfire.
So that triggered protests within Tunisia, which spread out through the region.
Yeah. Everyone watched Tunisia as the protests grew. I still remember so vividly the day that we turned on the TV to see this press conference stating that Ben Ali had fled the country. And people were like screaming in the streets, Ben Ali's ran, Ben Ali's done a runner. And people were inspired. People started coming out in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Syria, basically empowered to say, yeah, we're fed up with this shit too.
Where were you at the time?
I was here in the UK.
You were here in the UK?
Yeah, I was born here.
Okay, but you were following it.
Yeah.
You've obviously got friends and family in the region.
Yeah, pretty much all of my extended family are in Libya.
Okay. I've got questions about Libya as well. Okay, so this spread out throughout the Middle East, but there were some commonalities of what was happening from region to region of why people were pissed off.
Yeah, it's basically the same institutional structure: lack of accountability, lack of representation, oppression, corruption, dysfunctional institutions leading to dysfunctional economies where people can't make enough to survive. And there's only so much you can take of that before you reach the end of your tether.
Are there any regions or any countries within the Middle East that are different?
The oil monarchies are different because of their economies. They're so sustained by oil wealth that they didn't have those economic pressures. This was like just after Occupy Wall Street and the global economic crisis, if you remember. So a lot of places in the world were dealing with that economic pressure, and oil monarchies had the buffer to be able to deal with it slightly better, whereas you had spiraling food prices and massive unemployment in a lot of North Africa.
So when you're talking about the oil monarchies, Qatar, Saudi.
Yeah, the UAE, Bahrain.
Yeah. Okay, and so when when the Arab Spring protests were, you said, spread like wildfire, was there coordination between people in different countries?
There was, to an extent, but it wasn't like there was a single master plan. It was basically people getting inspired, people speaking to contacts. How did you organize this? What did you do? People starting their own Facebook groups and planning their own events. Like it was the early days of social media in the region as well. So people were inspired by what happened in Tunisia, and at the same time they were inspired by this new ability to coordinate and to reach their fellow citizens. We had a very closed information sphere for decades before that. Like the government controls the public squares, the government controls the published media, like the printed word, the printing presses, the government controls the TV channels, the radio channels. So you can't really get an unfiltered perspective from anywhere, and then suddenly social media appears. And suddenly you're connected to people, and you realize that everyone feels exactly the same as you do.
But there have been instances where, I certainly know of it in Iran, where they've blocked or they've blacked out the social media channels. I think Twitter was blocked at one point in Iran. Did the state try and fight back by doing this?
Yeah, it happened in a lot of places. It happened in Libya. As it was spiraling into a civil war, they basically cut internet for the entire country, and we mostly lost contact with our families for like a few months. They did it in Egypt. At the time, Twitter introduced the SMS to tweet service, which kind of added a lifeline. But it was by and large too late.
Because
people had already realized, yeah.
The Occupy Wall Street movement eventually failed because of a lack of coordination and leadership. Within these protests, these uprisings, was there any coordination? Were people trying to rally around opposition parties? Were they trying to? What were they trying to establish? What were
There
they
was, there was a massive amount of grassroots coordination.
Yeah.
But because of the legacy of decades of authoritarianism, there was kind of an allergy to hierarchy and structure. And that's one of the things that ultimately did the whole movement in.
Yeah, that was the same problem with Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
Is that, sadly, within these things, you often do need structural leadership or somebody to get behind.
Yeah, and it was even worse because in the West, you often have alternative institutions that you can rally behind. Mm-hmm. And like in Libya, there were basically 40 years of having no institutions at all, not even properly functioning government institutions. So as soon as the government unraveled, there was nothing, and it was complete anarchy.
Yeah, what was that in the timeline to Gaddafi being, as I remember it, he was essentially hauled off the streets and killed on the streets, wasn't he?
He was dragged out of a tunnel, like a sewage tunnel.
Yeah, like a rat, they said, didn't they?
Pretty much. Yeah, that was very satisfying to Libyans because that was the term that he'd used for the protesters as he threatened to like hunt them down one by one and kill them all.
Right. But his death has led to a power vacuum. Is it still in civil war?
It's in a lull right now. The different sides have entrenched. In the west of the country, you basically have militias occupying districts and cities and regions and suburbs and occasionally fighting, occasionally allying, and just relentlessly sucking the blood from the population. And in the east, you have a would-be military dictator who's managed to clamp down on things a lot more over there.
So is Libya in a better or worse place?
In terms of everyday life for the average person, it's definitely worse.
Okay.
But it's the consequence of what came before.
Of course. So, if you reflect on this and think, would there have been is there a better way, or is this like the natural order that the country has to go through to get past a dictator, has to go through this power vacuum, this next battle?
I think the optimal path is definitely institutional reform over a long period. But that's obviously only possible if the institutions are willing to be reformed and don't immediately try to kill you. And that's the lesson that like most of human history shows, because that's how it happened in the UK. It was like many centuries of slow institutional reform as the monarchy was stripped of powers one by one and they were given to parliament or different institutions.
We have seen limited reforms in places like Saudi, I believe, and I say very limited in that we see certain reforms that have led to a few more freedoms for females.
Social freedoms.
Freedoms, yeah. And we certainly saw reforms in Afghanistan led by the government that's put in place by the US, which have collapsed since the US has left. Have you seen any significant successes anywhere with reforms?
Not really. So Gary Kasparov put it very succinctly when he said the only real reform in a dictatorship is to be less of a dictatorship. And the problem with social reforms in Saudi Arabia, for example, is that just as they're given, they can be taken away at any moment because the actual power imbalance hasn't changed.
So on reflection, say with Libya, do you think the uprising was a good thing?
I think it was inevitable. And hopefully we're going to look back in a few decades and say, yeah, that was part of our path towards a more stable region. But it hasn't been pleasant to live through or to watch.
Is there anything that Western governments could be doing to help or support this? Or do they just always make things worse?
They mostly make things worse. And that's a product of a lot of different things. One of them is the chronic short-termism. So Obama had this interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, I think, in his last couple of years in office, where he basically said, like, yeah, my biggest mistake was that I took my eye off the ball. I thought the Brits were handling it, and the Brits thought I was handling it. And in the meantime, yeah, exactly. And in the meantime, this country, which had had no institutions for over 40 years and no freedom of speech, was told, you guys are free now, hold elections, you're good.
Yeah.
And then when there was a dispute about the election, there's no kind of process for sorting that out. There are no alternate authorities to appeal to. There's nothing.
It seems like an unusual, naive thing for Obama to be saying. I mean, what do you mean we thought you were handling it?
Well, the thing is, he doesn't really care. It doesn't matter to him whether Libya thrives or burns. And that's another kind of chronic problem with Western policymaking in the region, is that they don't actually care about our well-being. And much as they will laud these lofty ideals of human rights and democracy, it's actually about the bottom line for them. Like, what's in it for us? How much can we profit? Is there oil?
Can we sell you guns?
Exactly, yeah.
Which the British government have a long history of selling weapons to Saudi.
Pretty much anyone who'll buy them, but yeah, especially Saudi. And it's that cyclical short-sightedness, because it will eventually blow up in your face and you'll be dragged in to do an intervention or do some peacekeeping or, you know, get involved in a conflict one way or another, or there'll be like a terrorist movement that grows up in a power vacuum that you've created. And after you deal with that, you'll make your commitments to human rights and democracy and reform, and then just start behaving in exactly the same way again.
Are these potentially unsolvable problems?
I think they're very simple problems. I just think
unsolvable, though.
Yeah, they're definitely solvable if we approach them with a different kind of thinking to the one that created the problem. And that's what we're not doing.
Okay, so what created the problem?
How far do you want me to go back?
Educate me.
So me and my colleague Iyad al-Baghdadi wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Middle East Crisis Factory. And we basically go back to the end of colonialism. So as a region, we've been under colonialism for a few hundred years, depending on where. And we were left with no institutions, uneducated populations, desperate poverty. And in the vacuum, like, European powers withdrew after the Second World War because they were basically broke and couldn't maintain these colonies anymore. And in the vacuum, authoritarians came up to fill the void. And in response to years and decades of authoritarianism, you have people who are radicalized, who want to overthrow them by force. In some of these countries, the West was against the local dictator. In other countries, they were staunch allies, like Saudi Arabia. And that determined who the terrorist movements decided to pick as targets. Sometimes it was the government, sometimes it was its foreign backers. And what formed is this, what we call the vicious triangle of terrorists, tyrants, and foreign intervention. And to the naive mind, these are like in opposition to each other. But actually, each of the points of this triangle presents the logic for the continued existence of the others. So why is the dictator there? He's there to guard the independence of the nation and its sovereignty from foreign occupiers. Why are the foreign occupiers coming? Because of terrorists, or to bring democracy and get rid of a dictator. And why are the terrorists there? Either to get rid of this dictator who's got his boot on our necks, or to fight the foreigners. And it just goes around and round and round.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Noam Chomsky book, The Fateful Triangle, regarding the US, Palestine, and Israel. And
I haven't read that.
Yeah, it's a complex book trying to explain the relationship between those three countries. So, did anything good come out of the Arab Spring beyond? And when I say with regards to reforms of the state, not with regards to the people understanding they do have the power to revolt.
Maybe some minor reforms, like Tunisia was democratic until last year. It's now slipped back into authoritarianism, but there's arguably some knowledge of how to do it now. And there are some institutions which, although they're being dismantled, there's hope if this dictator gets removed again, then can re-proceed down that path. But I'd say most of the positives were the hope that it created and the belief that there is an alternative and we're not destined to live in this authoritarian hellhole forever.
So do you think there may be further waves of similar Arab Springs? I
think it's inevitable.
Okay. And is there kind of a bubbling of tension at the moment? But I mean, we're seeing it in other parts of the world. We're seeing it here in the West. We're seeing it in France and Holland.
Just before COVID, there was a revolution in Algeria. There was a revolution in Sudan. There were mass protests in Lebanon and a few other countries as well. And then basically COVID put a halt to that completely.
I mean, Lebanon is an absolute economic basket case.
Yeah, it's a failed state.
It's a failed state, yeah. We're planning to visit it actually at some point to go and make a film. But also, I mean, I follow Iran with a lot of interest. I mean, I saw already this week there was an incident where a lady wasn't covering her hair and somebody threw yogurt all over her. He
Yeah, I
was
saw that.
arrested and she was arrested. But there seems to be a concerted move by women within the country to push for reforms and more freedoms for women there. And there's a lot of tension, but there's a lot of bravery.
Yeah, and the
that's happening
government's
there.
losing control.
Yeah.
And I think you're also starting to see other segments of the population, like even men, basically saying, like siding with the woman in a lot of these street confrontations and attacking the people who are trying to enforce these morality codes and saying, we're fed up of this.
Are we seeing any reforms there in Iran?
I haven't seen any institutional reforms, but I'm not an Iran expert.
It's strange how this region seems to have a very similar problem from country to country, from state to state.
It was a very interconnected region.
Yeah.
For colonialism, we didn't really have nation-state borders. And we share a lot of cultural aspects. We share a majority religion. Most of the region shares a language, apart from Iran. And there are obviously minorities in the region, but there are so many commonalities that's just continued to the present day.
Okay, I wanted to talk to you now about Jamal Khashoggi. What is your link to? Or what was your link to Jamal?
So one of the issues we noticed was extremely pressing in the wake of the Arab Spring was the public sphere. As soon as citizens were able to discuss issues of common concern in a way that was free, they were able to do things about it and stuff started changing. And Facebook and Twitter were massive drivers of that. And in around 2014, like initially the dictatorships were not ready for it at all. And they were like stopping people in the street to check their phones and things like that obviously did nothing. Around 2014, they started to reorganize and they started to get this thing figured out. And there was, so I remember vividly a Saudi cartoonist called Twitter the Parliament of the Arabs. Like that's how central it became to the region's movements. Like there was no other place where we could get together and meet each other and understand what was going on and how we all felt about it. And they decided to shut that down. So around 2015, Saudi Arabia and Egypt and a few other countries started to flood Twitter specifically, but the internet generally, with trolls and bots and like fake content. And they'd basically mob you if you tried to have a discussion, a civil discussion in Arabic. They'd flood your mentions, they'd make it so you couldn't see the replies, they'd harass you, they'd abuse you, they'd threaten you. And it became completely unusable. And it, by and large, it stayed that way until today. Like most people don't tweet in Arabic anymore because it's just not a usable platform.